Welcome to Beyond the Text and our special series From Academy to Arena. Join me as we explore how political ideas collide with real-world political battles. Each episode unravels the complexities of translating theory into impactful change. Get ready for a captivating journey into the pulse of political thought. This is Beyond the Text, where ideas come to life. Welcome to our second meeting of our In Discussion series. Tonight we are honoured to be in the presence of the Director of Unlock Democracy, Tom Brake. The think tank is calling for constitutional reform to engage citizens across the nation and close the participation gap. Tom has held various portfolios in the Chamber, varying from Liberal spokesman for Environment, Transport and Regents to Deputy Leader of the House, and under the Coalition, the Chief Whip for the Liberals. With his wit and insight into the political sphere, the agenda will sure to be a lively one. You'll see I am uncommonly not wearing a tie, as per his refusal in the Chamber a few years back. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Tom Brake. I'm not entirely sure how we do that online, but, but thank you anyway, Tom. Okay, so the first question is coming from me. So what was your reasoning for becoming the new director of Unlock Democracy, and what did you see in the potential of the think tank?
Getting off to a good start. So first of all, a question, why did I start as the director at Unlock Democracy? Well, I suppose part of the answer to that question is I was made redundant by my electorate. So in December 2019, having been the Lib Dem Brexit spokesman for 2 years in a constituency that voted slightly to leave, but voted to one of the rare London constituencies that voted to leave, I think at that point my constituents thought that they'd had enough of me and so booted me out. And more positively, the role that, or the focus, the target that Unlock Democracy has in terms of its activities, its programme, is very much in keeping with the sorts of issues that I was active on in Parliament. So, as you said in your intro, Unlock Democracy, our principal objective is to try to secure a written constitution for the United Kingdom. But along the way, campaigning on things like transparency, accountability, devolution, electoral reform, many of the issues that I campaigned on in Parliament. So I was fortunate, really, that, in some respects, whilst, of course, I really regret no longer being a Member of Parliament, at the same time, having served for 22 years, it is a pretty intense it's a vocation, it's not a job, it's something that you do 6.5 days a week, 12 hours a day, day after day, week after week, year after year. And after 22 years, perhaps I was ready for a slight change. And of course, had I stayed on, the Parliament for present members of Parliament is a completely unknown quantity, and that everything that members of Parliament would have been able to do previously, most of that is no longer possible. So again, in terms of timing, perhaps not being in this Parliament was probably a good choice, and landing on my feet to becoming director at Unlock Democracy is something that I really welcomed and enables me to continue campaigning in the way that I used to do as a Member of Parliament.
Did you see that potential in the think tank just because of your sort of liberal outlook, as you sort of said from your experience in Parliament?
Well, I suppose I was aware of Unlock Democracy before applying, and Unlock Democracy used to be called Charter 88. Now, certainly people of my generation, Charter 88 was a major campaigning organisation that really grasped the a vision that the country had in the set up in 1988, and for many years was one of the leading campaigning organisations in the UK. Unfortunately, in recent years, for whatever reason, it's been in decline, and so I welcome the opportunity to get involved with an organisation whose values and principles I share, but an organisation that I want to see grow. And part of the reason why I'm on this Zoom call tonight is because, as an organisation, we are well represented when it comes to people of my age and my gender, but we are very badly represented in terms of our membership amongst younger people, BME communities, and women. So, one of my other tasks is to try to make us more representative as an organisation. I think democracy is something that many people are concerned about, and I just want to make sure that more people who have concerns join Unlock Democracy as a campaigning organisation.
And and we completely agree. And I think we've got a good turnout, sort of representation from what I can see tonight. And hopefully we can take that forward. And as you say, sort of shift that engagement demographic. So moving on to the second question, building off of that, which is, back in 2017, the New Statesman reported that Unlock Democracy said the failure of any party to gain a majority in the recent election has made the need for an inclusive, consensus-based working even more imperative. Now that the Conservative Party has gained a majority, has this changed your mind at all? And if not, would you get behind the idea of something like a progressive alliance?
Well, the difficulty with to come to the second half first, the difficulty with a progressive alliance is that certainly if it is formalised, is that, for instance, for the Liberal Democrats, the large majority of seats where the Liberal Democrats are in contention are seats where they're fighting the Conservatives. And a progressive alliance with the Labour Party and the Greens, for instance, would mean that in constituencies where a Liberal Democrat was fighting a Conservative, the Conservatives would be able to run a campaign argument that said voting Lib Dem is basically just voting Labour. So it's not clear that a progressive alliance would be particularly helpful if it was a very formal, open arrangement. Now, whether there will be more informal arrangements, which is exactly what happened in the last couple of elections, where, for instance, in seats where it was very clear that we were not in contention. I shouldn't say we anymore, as I'm not formally a Liberal Democrat, but in seats that the Liberal Democrats were no longer were not in contention in, like, for instance, Caroline Lucas's seat, our candidate stood down and gave her a clear run. And equally, the Greens did similar things in some of our seats. It's a pity they didn't in my seat, because had they done so, then maybe I would be appearing here as the Member of Parliament for Carshot and Wellington rather than the Director of Unlock Democracy. But it was not possible to reach an agreement in Carshot and Wellington with the Greens. And my majority was just 600, and that could have made the difference. So there are difficulties with a progressive alliance. What hasn't changed at all is my view that yes, the present voting system, which enables a party with 43% of the vote to secure an 80-seat majority, and to believe artificially, I would argue, that it has legitimacy to do absolutely anything it wants to do, that is something that has got to change. And that is something that previously, as a Liberal Democrat, I campaigned, and I'll continue to campaign on as the Director of Unlock Democracy. We cannot be, or we cannot continue to be, I think we are the only country in Europe that has a first past the post electoral system. And it comes with it some major disadvantages, which, and no one can even argue anymore that a first past the post system is a guarantee of a strong and stable government, because look at what happened in 2017 under a first past the post system. Nobody would argue that was a strong and stable government.
Yeah, most certainly. I think for the next question, I will head over to my Vice President, if I can unmute.
Hi, Tom. My name's Remy Brown. I'm the
Remy.
Vice President. Lovely to speak to you. So, in regards to the union, it's been a question that's been raised more and more over the past few weeks. How do you feel about the future of the union, and could any policy proposal from Unlock Democracy cure any qualms that people would have?
Okay. So I have great concerns about the union, and it was very obvious to me 4 years ago during the referendum campaign that one of the major consequences of voting to leave the European Union would be potentially to fracture the United Kingdom. And I think there is a real risk that that is going to happen. We've seen Scotland, obviously, which voted to remain. That has put sort of rockets under the campaign for independence. And in Ireland and Northern Ireland, the possibility of a vote in Northern Ireland over reunification, that has probably accelerated as well as a result of the strange arrangements there, which in effect keep the Northern Ireland in the European Union. I think there are other factors in play. I think in the Republic of Ireland, Republic of Ireland in recent years has become more liberal in its outlook. If you look at things like abortion, for instance. So yes, I'm very worried about the union. Now, Unlock Democracy, we believe in processes that allow the members of the public to drive the process. So, for instance, I don't have in my pocket a written constitution that I can slap on the table and say, this is what our written constitution should look like, because we want that to be a process that people can be engaged with from the outset. I think that, for instance, the public, if they're involved in a representative group of people involved in a citizens' assembly or citizens' convention, I think they want to see things like reform of the electoral system. I think the public, all the evidence is they'd want that changed. I think also that the public on the whole are in favour of the United Kingdom. And I suspect that what the public would want to see in a constitution would be something that increased the level of sort of federalism in the United Kingdom. In other words, gave Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland greater powers than they've got currently, greater autonomy, probably still kept control of things like defence and foreign affairs at a UK level. But I think that is a possible solution that would emerge, and certainly one that I personally would favour, a federal solution. And I think that is our last chance of trying to stop independence. It was interesting, I was on a call a couple of months ago with Joanna Cherry, one of the prominent SNP MPs, and she used to be someone who was in favour of federalism. So even if someone like a very prominent independence SNP MP was until fairly recently in favour of federalism, I think we could sell that to the Scottish public, and I think would both give them the autonomy that they want, but at the same time would not impose on them the problems associated with Brexit, because this is where I think the SNP are being extremely dishonest. They are rightly highlighting all of the problems that the UK is now encountering as a result of Brexit, but pretending that exactly the same problems would not emerge if Scotland left the United Kingdom, because of course they would. Exactly the same problems over things like borders would apply in spades in that scenario as well. So federalism, I think, would be the way of trying to square this particular circle.
Do you think that there is almost a silent majority in Scotland that are pro the union, and that the separatists just have a louder voice or a larger media presence?
Well, certainly the latter is true. They have a louder voice and a larger media presence. And talking to friends who live in Scotland, they do describe some aspects of the SNP in quite a derogatory manner in terms of the way that they have established a stranglehold on many institutions. Okay. And perhaps you need to be a little bit careful about speaking out about things when you disagree with the government. If you're an organisation, for instance, receiving funding from the SNP. So, unfortunately, the polls are very clear at the moment. The polls say that there has been a consistency in the polls that says if there was an independence referendum tomorrow, then people would vote for independence. Of course, the same happened with the Brexit referendum, where there was a series of polls that said if there was a Brexit referendum, people would vote to stay. And then, of course, they did the opposite. So, we can't be certain that what the polls say today in terms of independence is what would how people would vote tomorrow. And of course, in the first referendum, or the most recent Scottish referendum, once the discussions about things like, okay, so you want to be independent, but you want to keep the pound. Can you explain how that works economically? Then all of a sudden, the SNP started to have problems in explaining how this was going to work. So maybe if it comes under scrutiny with the Brexit implications, for instance, then maybe suddenly the Scottish public may wake up to the fact that this sort of nirvana that is being offered about independence actually comes with some fairly high prices attached to it that they may find not so attractive once it's put under the spotlight.
Yeah, definitely. And also, in regards to your days in government, would you say that more can be done policy-wise if you're in government rather than in opposition?
Absolutely. I mean, my first 13 years as a member of Parliament were incredibly frustrating. I was a Liberal Democrat member of Parliament. By the end of that 13 years, we did have a significant number of MPs. So we had up to 60 MPs. But the fact is that when you're in opposition, you can do very little, if anything at all. And you can certainly do very little when in the first two parliaments, and even the third parliament under Tony Blair, the government majority was 200. So when you've got a government with a majority of 200 and you're an opposition party, well, you can kick and scream and shout, but frankly, it's not going to make very much difference. So you can definitely do a lot more when you are in government. But even then, the reality is that this cliche about government's a super tanker and it takes a long time to turn it around is true. I mean, you have, for instance, funding streams that are all already allocated to things. And if you suddenly want to spend a huge amount more on X, then you've got to cut back significantly on Y. And the area where you're proposing cutting back on Y starts to kick back and say, well, hold on there. Have you thought about the implications? So it is clearly easier, but it is still a challenge for any government to implement radical policies. Perhaps the best example of that is the changes that were made to benefits and universal credit, which I think when it was originally proposed was going to take 3 or 4 years to implement, and 10 years later is still basically being rolled out. So, these big changes are things that can take a much longer than you expect, and often at much greater cost.
Yeah, definitely. I think our next question's being asked by Dara.
He's our treasurer. I shall ask him to unmute.
Yeah. Hi, Tom. What I want to ask is that why do you think in 2015 it unfortunately turned out so bad for the Liberal Democrats? Do you think it was a change in terms of what the electorate are looking for when it comes to polling day, or do you think it was something else?
Well, yes. I mean, the election was catastrophic for us. So we dropped to just 8 MPs. We thought we were going to perhaps fall to about 30. So it's much worse than we thought. And I suppose the reality is that if you are an opposition party and you have been in opposition for a long period of time, as we had been, it's probably fair to say that you can say and do things for which you're not going to be held entirely responsible. You can make propositions in terms of what government should do, which perhaps are not always as carefully costed as they should be, and so on. The reality is then, and people start to appreciate your position as a party of opposition, which is always challenging the government, always proposing perhaps the sorts of things that people want to hear. But the reality is, as I was saying in relation to Remy's question, when you do get into government, some of the things that you were saying in opposition, suddenly you find you can't actually deliver them. You might have had good intentions, but you can't deliver them. And people were, I think, less forgiving of the pledges that we made, perhaps tuition fees being the best example, because for the first time as a party, we were a party of government. They were less forgiving of us than they have been of the other two parties, because the other two parties have made pledges that they have not delivered, and haven't suffered to the same extent in terms of their level of support at the next election. And I suppose the other factor that hurt us was that in lots of seats, including mine, Labour voters we would have said to Labour voters in seats where we were fighting the Conservatives, so where we were in second place to the Conservatives, we would have said, look, there's no point voting Labour, because all you can do by voting Labour is you'll end up with a Tory, whereas if you vote Liberal Democrat, then you will get a Liberal Democrat, and you won't get a Conservative. And whilst in my seat that is true, they did get a Liberal Democrat, and the alternative would have been a Conservative. That Liberal Democrat then happened to end up in coalition with the Conservatives. So if you're a Labour voter, having voted Liberal Democrat because you thought this was the way of stopping the Tories, and then to find that the Liberal Democrats facilitated in their eyes a Conservative government, then clearly you're going to suffer a backlash, and that happened without a doubt. The final thing I'd say about that is that actually, I think if you look at what the coalition government achieved in terms of 5 years of stability and delivering a common programme that had been agreed between the two parties, I would say that the contrast between that and the last 5 years is quite dramatic in terms of what has been achieved. So I think we played an important role at a time when, the country in 2008 had gone into a major meltdown economically, with the banks, on the verge of collapse. And we had pretty much turned that around at the end of a 5-year period of stability. Well, the last 5 years have not been like that, I would say.
And what do you think is the future for the Lib Dems? Where do you think what direction do you think the party will need to head in order to gain ground, so to speak, in the next few years?
Yeah, to some extent, where we go and what we do depends on the other parties. That's always been the case. So it's very clear that in probably in the last 30 years, we have always done better when there was a moderate Labour Party. And the explanation for that is that, and this was the case in 2019, when the electorate are presented with either Boris Johnson, who I would argue is pretty much on the right of the Conservative Party, or Jeremy Corbyn, well, the public are a bit worried about, I can't risk a Liberal Democrat vote, because if I do, I might end up with the other person I really hate. So I think then you end up with a really fierce squeeze on the other parties, the smaller parties, and that is what we suffered from, but in 2015 and 17 and 19. So in terms of where we go now, well, I think there is still a strong appetite for liberal values, which is what the Liberal Democrats stand for. And that's freedom of speech, civil liberties, that's speaking out against government plans to clamp down on demonstrations. So, the government at one point were looking at whether Extinction Rebellion should be categorised as a terrorist organisation. Yeah. Now they've gone off that idea, but I think more of that is the sort of thing we can expect. And that's why I think there's a market for, there's a merit in having a party that is liberal. And I think one of the things that we found in coalition, so when we were talking with, and we talked with both parties in 2010, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and it was clear that from a civil liberties point of view, the Conservative Party at that point was probably closer to where we were than the Labour Party, because there is quite a strong authoritarian streak in the Labour Party. And so that's why I think no one should assume that the Labour Party is a party of liberal democracy. I don't think in many respects it is. and that is, or necessarily an internationalist party, or a party that is willing to speak out openly in favour of migration, for instance. I think that's something that we can do as a party, or the Liberal Democrats can do as a party, and a best place to do. And of course, if we were in a system of proportional representation elections, then of course the Liberal Democrats would be a party in all probability in government. Because the 11% of the vote that we got in 2019, that represents 70 seats in Parliament. Yeah. It doesn't represent the just over 10 that we've got.
Brilliant. I think the next question is coming from Baptiste.
Yeah, I'll unmute him now. That was really interesting, though. You'd think that when politics is at polar opposites, the third party would be the go-to. But actually, the fact that you say that people fear in that sense that either if you don't cast your vote for one of those two candidates, then the other, the worse, or the evil will get in.
Hi, Tom. I'm Baptiste Bay. I'm the Social Secretary. I was going to ask, in the House of Commons, you raised the point with regards to EU citizens and foreign expats and their security and settlement in the UK post-Brexit. What do you believe to be the best course of action to protect these citizens from a constitutional perspective?
Well, I mean, there was an opportunity a few years ago for the government to settle this, I think, in terms of providing full rights. But that is not what has happened. There are a large number of EU citizens who I believe do have full rights to stay here, who have not ended up with the permanent settled status, but have ended up with a provisional status because maybe they didn't fill in the forms correctly, or they weren't able to provide the documentation, or the government or the Home Office simply put them in that category. So there's a large number of EU citizens who now have to wait to be able to demonstrate that they've had their 5 years continuously. And of course, what we had confirmed a few days ago was that EU citizens who might have been here legitimately for a long period of time, but might have ended up in this wrong category, which required them to then sort of accumulate 5 years, are now being told that from a COVID point of view, if they, for instance, if they lost their job here and decided to go back home and then have spent a certain amount of time out of the United Kingdom, then they lose their rights as an EU citizen. So I think there's a large body of people who are going to be quite badly affected. And of course, what hasn't really kicked in yet is enforcement of this. Because I think it's still till June this year that there's a period of a transition period where people can still regularise their situation. After that, I think that is when we will start. Maybe it's July. I think it's July. After that, that is the point when all of the problems that the Windrush generation had, with people saying, well, you say you've been here this long, but you can't prove it, off you go to the country that you haven't been living in for the last 50 years, we might start to see similar sorts of things happening. And of course, the number of EU citizens here is very, very significant. So, if it affects a very small percentage of people, that ends up being a very large number of people in real terms. So I think there is still some major issues that could hit us, particularly after that July cut-off period, after which everyone has to regularise their situation.
And with regards to Brexit again, do you feel that the UK will continue to sell off its assets to foreign businesses for short-term gain, or will there be a shift away from the Thatcherite consensus of the global market to a longer-term approach? And would this be a good or bad thing?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether, the UK leaving the EU, whether in terms of, if you're talking about globalisation, whether that sort of restricts our appetite for globalisation. I'm not sure, because, of course, there's a strong faction within the government who, for instance, this idea of free ports, where basically there is very little in terms of regulation, very little in terms of tax, that is almost sort of laissez-faire sort of competition, which is going to be an interesting problem for the Conservatives, because, of course, they have acquired a certain number of seats in the so-called red wall seats, where actually a lot of those voters who are ex-Labour voters, what they want to see probably is more state involvement, more state spending on jobs and things like that, not a laissez-faire capitalism that perhaps some in the Conservative Party, people like Priti Patel, people, Dominic Raab, people who've written pamphlets about these things, the sort of thing that they would like to see. So I think from a policy perspective, there are going to be some quite interesting tensions within the Conservative Party about which way they go and whether they can keep everyone on board.
All right, perfect. Hello, thank you for being with us tonight. It's been on the tip of your tongue for some time now, but I would like to talk about electoral reform. How can we set about reforming the electoral system from first past the post without severing the tie between the MP and the local community? I'm originally from the Netherlands, and I know with a proportional system, we have a lot of problems with connection between members of parliament and the public. So how can you do this without preventing the threat of floating MPs without a dedicated seat, and also ensure the system is transparent and easy enough to understand by the general public?
Sure, very good question. Well, first of all, in the UK now, in terms of how we vote, first past the post is a bit of a rarity. In that, if you look at the way the Scottish Parliament works, the Welsh Parliament, if you look at the way that, for instance, the London Assembly works and so on, actually first past the post is the exception rather than the rule. So the British public are already familiar with different ways of voting for a number of different types of elections. So I think in terms of an understanding of it, I don't think that is necessarily a problem. In terms of maintaining the constituency link, well, first of all, it's worth pointing out that there are some constituency members of parliament who are good constituency MPs for whom that link means something. And I would certainly have put myself in that category. Having lived in my constituency I lived in it for 7 years before I was elected and lived in it for the 22 years I was a member of parliament. And I reached a point where I think we did a poll in terms of name recognition. I think my name recognition was something like 95% in the constituency. But not every member of parliament is a good constituency MP. There are members of parliament who actually never, ever go to their constituency. They might turn up to do the odd surgery. They might go for a really big event, but actually they live somewhere else. So, you can overplay this argument about how important it is to have a constituency link. But clearly there are a number of systems, and, take the Scottish system or the London Assembly system. You do have a mixture of constituency representatives and list representatives. So in the London Assembly, for instance, you have a London Assembly member who represents the Sutton and Croydon area. And you also have a number of list Assembly members who represent the whole of London. So you can maintain the constituency link with some, but not necessarily with all of them. And then you have the system that was used for the European elections, so regional. So, everyone who's elected in London was elected to represent London. Everyone elected in the Southeast represented the Southeast, where, okay, the constituencies are very large, but there is some sort of link with a region. So no system is perfect, but I think the system we have got is the most imperfect of all. And that's why no other country in Europe uses it. And it creates a system where a party doesn't think that it needs to talk to other parties, even though it represents only a minority. 57% of the people did not vote for the present government. They do not have authority from the public to run a program that excludes 57% of the public, and most of the time that is what they are doing. So a system, and I think the coalition was a very good example. Clearly, the public certainly didn't like the Liberal Democrat involvement in it, because we were very heavily punished for that. Although we knew that was the evidence from Europe. In a coalition in Europe, the junior party, the smaller party, always gets hammered harder than the major party. So we were sort of aware of that. But actually, that process of consensus worked. And what it meant was that Conservative ministers were open in saying to the Liberal Democrats in coalition, we're really pleased that we're in coalition with you, because if we weren't, people like Dominic Raab, Priti Patel, the people that I'm naming, who are, of course, now our ministers, we would have to have them in our government. And we do not want that. That's the last thing we want, some of the fringe people. And now, of course, that's exactly what they've got. So, in a coalition, you have an opportunity to reach a consensus, which I think does smooth off the rough edges in terms of what each party is proposing, and you actually end up with a better way forward than simply a minority party imposing its view on a majority of the country.
Fantastic. I don't know if Sav wants to say anything, or if he's done. No, he's done. We can go back to Baptiste. I think he's back. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. My software crashed. My following question was on the Leave campaign and the whole claims around taking back control of our borders, security, money, and our economy, and whether it was an emotive yet at the same time unrealizable argument, and to what extent was the campaign for Leave built upon an underlying lie?
Well, I hesitate to say it was built on a lie, because politicians, you always want to present your arguments in the best way possible and so on. But I think that the major problem with the campaign was that they were two very different campaigns that really didn't connect. So the Remain campaign, we ran a campaign based on head, and the Leave campaign ran a campaign based on heart. And we now know, and this is probably always going to be the case, that campaigns run on heart normally beat the campaign that is focused on people's heads, because they had all the emotive messages: take back control, take back control of our borders, blah blah. And our answer to that was, well, look, the UK economy depends on the EU as a major trading partner. We do 50% of our trade. Well, when you're trying to those two arguments are clashing head to head. Unfortunately, the take back control argument, particularly appealing to a group of people who feel excluded, who went out to vote for the first time in a very long time, then the emotive argument is going to win. We are, of course, now seeing that there wasn't really very much substance to the claims that were made in the Leave campaign about the benefits to the United Kingdom. I think every day we are seeing what the disbenefits are of leaving the EU. We're not seeing very many benefits. Maybe the vaccines is one of the benefits of leaving the EU. That is possibly true. I think, however, that had the UK been in the EU still, I suspect the UK might have argued quite strongly against the European Union taking on that role, because the European Union, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a particularly strong sort of health focus, and perhaps it should not have attempted to do that. I mean, I understand the reasons why they did it, but I think in practice, probably that was a mistake. But everything else, the news we've heard today about trading shares, Amsterdam overtaking London, for instance, the news we're hearing about, the Department for International Trade, their advisors telling UK businesses who are contacting them saying, I've got problems exporting to the EU, advising them to set up companies in the EU to get around the problem. All of these things we knew about, we were saying it again and again and again. I lost count of how many debates I was in where I said this. We were told that we were liars, that we were making it up, all these scare stories and so on. But the reality is that when you go from a very close trading arrangement, I think the first time this has happened probably anywhere in the world, a very close trading arrangement to one that is less close, you're going to have more obstacles. It's obvious, you can't dispute it. And now that is what we're finding. And the UK is going to suffer. I don't know whether there's going to be is there a question on Brexit mobility? Because I might just talk briefly about that. And I think the consequence for young people, I can give you a very, very clear illustration of the consequence for young people. So as the director of Unlock Democracy, I have been recruiting people over the last couple of months, and I was getting applications from people who were EU citizens. And they were saying, are you willing to sponsor me? So these are EU citizens living in the EU, not ones who are based in the United Kingdom. And I had to say, look, I'm really sorry, I can't do that. It's too much trouble. I've got enough applications coming in from the UK, so I'm afraid I can't consider your application. That will be happening now to every single Brit who applies for a job in the European Union, where they will be looking, their potential employer will be saying, well, I've got 50 applications from EU citizens around the EU, and I've got 5 from the UK. Why would I want to go to the extra trouble of agreeing to sponsor someone to come to the UK? So you're really going to have to be head and shoulders above any of the other contenders for that employer to want to consider going through the extra hoops that they've got to go through now. So I think in terms of young people in the UK, and of course young people in the EU, this is a huge disbenefit, and it's not going to be, there's no evidence that it's going to be compensated for by something else. There's no evidence that the US is suddenly going to say, okay, UK, you've left the EU, you can't go there easily now to work, so we're going to open up our borders to you so you can come to the US instead. I see no evidence that's going to happen. So it's a loss for everybody. Now, for some communities, and these are the communities who felt, disadvantaged or felt they've been left out, maybe they'll think there is a benefit, and the benefit is that jobs that have been taken in their communities by people from abroad, from the EU, now won't be taken. The problem I have with that is that the government have recently announced a huge increase in the number of visas they're going to allow for agricultural workers to come to the UK from the EU, because they know we haven't actually got the people here or the people who are willing or able to do the work. My wife's family are farmers in Kent, and they know, they've had experience, I'm afraid the UK citizen who comes to them from the job centre to do a picking job in a field will last a day. And after that day, they'll say, oh, sorry, this is too hard, and they don't come back. Whereas the citizens they get from Romania or Bulgaria, they will come and they will work the solid 3 months or 6 months, and they will work. And so we are going to be dependent on people from the EU. All we've done is made it more difficult for employers here to recruit them. And of course, all that means is extra cost, which ends up getting passed on to the consumer.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I think we will now go to our secretary, Alexandra. I shall unmute her. There we are.
Hi, I'm Alexandra. So you said back in 2015 that you felt there could have been more accommodation to allow the increase in the profile of the Lib Dems as opposed to the coalition. So even as Chief Whip and Deputy Leader of the House, was it still hard to get your Liberal voices heard? And what was the experience like to be in such a position of power?
You've done your research well. So I did say that indeed. And my target for saying that was the Speaker, John Bercow, because the UK, we don't have a tradition of coalition governments. And what we have is a tradition of 2 parties. And so even the sort of physical space that the parties work in the chamber is designed for two parties. You have a government bench and you have an opposition bench, and all the other opposition parties, you get squeezed over to the corner, into the corner. So the whole system is devised for two parties. Now, when in coalition, John Bercow was presented with a coalition government, what he could have done but didn't do was recognise that, yes, we're in coalition, but the Liberal Democrats are still an independent party. We're not an offshoot of the Conservative Party, and therefore I think he should have given us far more opportunities than he did to formally stake our independence in terms of key debates, for instance. So if you look at the history, I think we were allowed 2 occasions in coalition over a 5-year period where we were allowed to express a different view as the junior coalition partner, because of course most of the time the official government position in a coalition where there are 5 times as many Conservatives as there are Liberal Democrats, the official government position is the Conservative position. So if the Speaker doesn't allow the minor party or the smaller party to have opportunities to express a different view, people think that the Liberal Democrats are basically the Conservatives, because that's all people ever hear from. And so there were 2 occasions. Once over the Leveson inquiry about sort of press and the regulation of the press, and then once just before the 2015 general election, where Danny Alexander was allowed to make an alternative Chancellor's speech. I think those were the only 2 occasions where, as a party, we were able to stand up in Parliament and say, actually, yes, we're in coalition, but we have our own identity, and here's a demonstration of that difference. And I think John Bercow didn't recognise that. He basically treated the coalition as if it was the Conservative Party, and I think that contributed to the very bad result that we got in the 2015 election, because people didn't hear a distinctive Liberal Democrat voice. All they heard was a coalition, therefore a Conservative voice.
Oh, marvellous. Thank you, Tom. And I think the next one is coming from our second-year rep, Eric.
Hi. I was reading that you are the honorary associate of the National Secular Society. And so would you say you're content with the current state where the Queen is head of state and also the head of the Church of England? And if not, how would you go about secularizing this?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have the answer in terms of how you go about doing it, but certainly I think one of the anomalies, as I see it, in terms of the House of Commons, for instance, is the fact that every single day's business starts with prayers, COE prayers. Now, I'm not religious. I'm an atheist. But the problem with having that arrangement is that certain things are linked to you being present in the chamber for prayers, for instance. So if you want to reserve your seat for that day's debate, you have to be in the chamber for prayers, not if you're the Prime Minister, because you people will make way for you, or if you're the leader of the opposition. But if you're a backbencher or a member of one of the smaller opposition parties, if you want to have a position in the chamber, you have to be in there for prayers. And obviously there are quite a lot of people in the Commons who are of faith but not of COE. So they also have to, if they want to secure their place in the chamber, they have to sit in prayers. So I think that is something which can, in my view, can be easily changed. And some members of Parliament, me included, have a sort of had a seated protest during prayers where we would sit down and do our look at our phones or read our papers in objection to this process. And yes, I think the monarchy, and I think your question is particularly pertinent because of what, I don't know whether you've seen the coverage in the last couple of days of allegations that both the Queen and Prince Charles have been getting advanced sight of some of the bills that have been coming to the House of Commons, and have been using the advantage they have of getting advanced sight of them to try to influence those bills, in a way that's advantageous to their Prince Charles's business, for instance. Well, I don't think that's acceptable. So I think there are ways in which, and I suppose you wouldn't need to do very much, because the role really is, it's a figurehead role in relation to, the Queen gives royal assent, for instance, but in practice she never says no. So, there are lots of processes that are gone through that actually could be quite easily removed from this process. But I must admit, I haven't thought through the details of how you get from where we are now, but there are certainly some very straightforward steps that could be taken to rationalise our system and our processes.
Marvellous. Well, I think it's going to come back to my Vice President and I now. I'll go over to Rem. Can Remy unmute himself, or do I have to? Marvellous.
So in the nature of the consensus politics that we are trying to promote in society, who is an inspiration, or was an inspiration, when you were in the House of Commons? Somebody from across the floor, or somebody you even admired?
Well, I suppose a good example would be, two examples, I suppose, that both link to foreign affairs, because I think the position that a country adopts in relation to foreign affairs is quite significant in terms of what you're trying to say about your country. And the first person I'd mention is Robin Cook, who was obviously the Labour Foreign Secretary, who put forward this idea of an ethical foreign policy. And I suppose I would say that Charles Kennedy, who was our leader during the Iraq War period, then demonstrated exactly what an ethical foreign policy should be about. An ethical foreign policy should be about observing United Nations sort of declarations on matters of that nature. And I think, Robin Cook obviously stood down, and Charles, I think something that is forgotten is that there was significant opposition. I think perhaps nowadays people look back and think, well, everyone would have been against the war in Iraq. Well, actually, no, everyone was in favour of it, except for the Liberal Democrats and a number of, a few mavericks in the other two parties. At the point when this started, everyone, Labour, Conservative, certainly prominent frontbenchers and backbenchers, and the press were very much in favour of the war in Iraq. And a party and a leader like Charles Kennedy standing up and saying, no, we don't think this is right, we don't think the evidence is there, brought down a whole heap of proverbial on his head. And it required some sort of tough, adopting a tough stance to maintain that in the face of attacks about, because obviously if your troops are going to war and you're saying it's not a good thing, then you immediately open yourself up to the charge of being a traitor and putting troops in danger, whilst not supporting what they're doing. But it was the right call. So I think that it's interesting that whole discussion now about ethical foreign policy has almost gone full circle. That, again, something I welcome, with a number of Conservative members of Parliament saying that we should adopt an ethical foreign policy. Or ethical trade policy in relation to China, and not be willing to trade with a country that is guilty, I think, of genocide. Now, if you think back to if people had been aware at the time of what was happening in the concentration camps in Germany and Poland and so on, and we would then have agreed a trade deal with Germany, that surely makes people stand up and think, well, that would have been outrageous. But the evidence seems to suggest that if we embark on a trade deal with China now, we will be doing so with a country that is conducting genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. So I think the people who are campaigning against this and trying to get written into the trade deals, the fact that we will not do trade deals with countries that are responsible for genocide is a very positive thing.
To lead on from the consensus side of things, is it easy to leave one's own and forget about your opposition's political views when you have a personal relationship with them?
Well, I can probably answer that question in relation to coalition. The experience of coalition. So before we went into coalition, I had spent. So I was I was selected to fight my seat in 1990. Moved to the constituency, and the incumbent was a Conservative Member of Parliament. So I fought him for 7 years, got elected in 97, and then between 97 and 2010. My opponent was the Tory. This seat is a Tory Lib Dem marginal, and it still is. And then all of a sudden in 2010, as a party, we were now in coalition with the party that I had been fighting basically since Margaret Thatcher was our Prime Minister. So that was quite unusual. But I think what was refreshing about it is that actually, you can be tribal, you can scream and shout, you can say, your party's got all the best policies and the other party can't, has no policies worth speaking of. But in practice, when you sit down and negotiate and identify that there is common ground, I think you actually end up with a far more sensible approach to politics. So we, the Lib Dems, we've experienced that. Some of the Conservative MPs will have experienced that with us in coalition, although, of course, a lot of the ones who are in ministerial positions now won't have done because they were the ones the Conservatives of the day wanted to exclude from being in government. Yeah. They were too extreme. But I think what is revealing, though, is that for the Labour Party, they remain, I think, the most tribal party because they've not had this experience of trying to negotiate with another party and accepting that actually another party may have something to contribute and may actually potentially have a better policy proposal than your own. So I think coalition does make you think differently about another party. It doesn't make you think differently about everyone in that party, but it probably makes you think differently about half of the people in that party because you can see that you can have a working relationship with them. So the people I had a working relationship with were Andrew Lansley, who was the person who's the health secretary responsible for the reforms that are now going to be scrapped by the government, scrapped strangely in the middle of a COVID crisis, which, you reorganising the deck chairs at the NHS on the Titanic when the Titanic has actually just hit the iceberg. It's not a question of, the NHS is under the greatest strain it's ever been under. That is not, my view, the point at which you start to reorganise the NHS. I mean, by all means, yes, perhaps it needs to happen, but not mid the worst pandemic we've ever been hit with. So it was Andrew Lansley, who I got on with very well, and then William Hague. And William Hague was an interesting character because William Hague made that transition. When he was the party leader, he was all about, save the pound and the Union Jack and so on. When he was in coalition, actually, he was quite moderate. And since, he was one of the people, flagging or raising concerns over Brexit. So, I think he's been on an interesting journey in terms of his political positioning.
Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Tom. And going off of that in terms of your colleagues and working alongside. So what do you think about a society like ours as we sort of come to the end of our committee questions? Is it time for consensus rather than adversarial politics across these party boundaries that we've mentioned throughout the questions?
I certainly think so. And I can point to the fact that I've practiced what I'm preaching in terms of coalition and being a minister in that government for 3 years and making the coalition work. Now that's particularly over tuition fees is something that many Liberal Democrats suffered for very heavily. We had made an agreement in terms of a programme that we were going to deliver, and most of us delivered it. And I think if you if you want to form a government, that's probably what you have to do in terms of reaching consensus. But what it meant was that if you look at the people, what percentage of the population were represented by ministers in the coalition? Well, it was 60, I can't remember exactly what the figures were, but 65% of the population had a stake in and a representative in the government that was delivering that programme over 5 years. And I mean, certainly if we look to US politics, the last thing we need is the sort of divergence and split that they have seen there. I think there's a risk that this could happen here. Clearly, to some extent, it happened during the Brexit referendum. Perhaps some of that is being as we're losing a little bit of that friction that occurred. But I mean, I think the evidence from around the world is that when countries work in coalition, when they work as a consensus, when, for instance, Jacinda Ardern invites in a member of parliament from another party into her government when she didn't actually need to, then I think that is the sort of approach that is likely to lead to better government and ensure that people are better represented than they would be otherwise.
And it will be interesting to see, I'm sure Baptiste is interested with En Marche and their sort of coalition of people they've got behind them now as well, see if that can continue. But yeah, well, thank you very much, Tom, for answering all of our questions. And I suppose I can open it up to the floor of people now. I don't know if people want to message or raise their hand if they've got a question, and I'll be able to see. And I can unmute you, or you can send a message in if anyone has any questions for Tom.
Alex has got one.
Alex has got one. I'll go to Alex first. Shall I read Fab?
Varun had a question.
And Fabio's got one. With your past as a computer software consultant, do you find the increased online censorship and privacy infringements by big tech worrying? And do you think we will see some sort of regulation of it within the coming years?
Well, firstly, I think my memories of the IT industry are now rather vague, and clearly things
rapidly changing.
Well, they were. So of course, 25 years ago, when I was in the IT industry, yes, we had just had email. Email was just starting to feature. So I joined an IT company in 1983. I think we were one of the first sort of businesses in the country to get email, because we were an IT company. So that was fairly obvious it would come to us first. But things like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram, Snapchat, none of that existed at all, full stop. So I think a major difficulty for government is actually keeping on top of those developments, because regulations, to write regulations is something that takes time, effort, requires experts and so on. And I think the real challenge is that I can't see how any government is ever going to be able to keep up with that technological development in a way that they can sort of preempt things that the big tech companies are going to be doing. I think the governments are always going to be running to catch up, and I think that is something that is of concern, because if companies, I think in China, they've now developed software that enables people, facial recognition software that basically means that anyone in China can be tracked probably at any moment of the day. These sorts of technologies often get deployed in the UK before there has been a process of trying to establish whether that's something we want. And if it's something we want, do we want it everywhere? Do we want everyone to be subject to it? And often the rollout of this sort of technology is happening before those discussions have taken place. So I think it's a big challenge for government. And I took part in debates probably 7 or 8 years ago when we were looking at Facebook And it was very clear that Facebook then was being used for sort of drug dealing in a way that the regulations just didn't consider, because no one had thought about it. So there are really big challenges, and the sophistication with which data companies extract data and manipulate it in a way to find out more about you than you would like, and find out your predilections. You'll probably have heard that the company can look at people's likes and what they follow and get an almost perfect picture of what that person is like,
who they are,
simply from which sites they're going to, what they're liking, and so on. And if you add in the development that the Chinese have now found that it is possible, apparently, and this does sound rather unlikely, but you can, with something like 70% accuracy, determine how someone is likely to vote from their facial appearance. Then you really wonder where. I know it sounds absurd, but this is sort of well, I'm not going to say it's a fact, but it's something that a company can demonstrate, and you can do that simply by you talk to people who have that facial appearance, whose voting intention because they've told you, and then you sort of work out what the rough characteristics are, and then you create a template that you then put onto other people, and you can then end up mapping this. So the technology is developing at a pace that we can't possibly keep track of, and I think we should all be particularly worried about that.
Well, it's fascinating, and we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'll try and fire through them. Shall we go to Varun next? Did Varun want to ask it himself, Rem? I'll go to Varun. Just there. Varun?
He's obviously trying to hide his face, so we don't know what his political affiliation is.
If not, I can come back to him and go straight to Alex, and we can come back to him. Where is Alex? His Wi-Fi's cut out, that's why.
Okay.
There we are. Alex Dale will ask a question, I think.
I wanted to ask, what do you think the greatest challenge Britain needs to overcome in its future is?
Okay, so what is the greatest challenge that the UK has to overcome? I'm afraid it is the tail end of COVID, because the impact of COVID, whether it's on the economy or education, health, is something that is likely to live with us for 20 or 30 years. I mean, the level of investment or the level of indebtedness that the government has incurred is 3 or 4 times the scale that happened during the after the 2008 crash. The level of the waiting lists for people for operations in the NHS is now at its highest level, I think, since records began. There was a report a few days ago that, unfortunately, as a result of the failure in education, or the gap in terms of education, that people are likely to earn on average £40,000 less over their lifetime because of their lower levels of attainment. We know that the gap between high-performing children and children who perform less well has grown, for the simple reason that one cohort is likely to have had better access to IT and online than the other, and so on. So all of these things are something which is going to stay with us for a very long time. And overlay on top of that the impact of Brexit. Now, Brexit hasn't really kicked in yet. So the difficulties we've seen are happening at a point where some of the checks that are going to be imposed haven't been imposed yet because there's been a waiver. So we've not seen the worst of this yet. So you impose that on top of it. How did the government get out of this? Well, I don't see that there's any way of getting out of it apart from some very substantial tax rises. I mean, and that I would hope would be tax rises targeted on the wealthiest. And there are some, and also companies. There are some companies that have done reasonably well out of the last 12 months. But if there aren't fairly substantial tax increases, then as a nation, we are going to be paying a very high level of debt. I mean, a very high level of interest on our debt for decades to come. And of course, what you're paying on interest payments is not going into health and education and all the other things you want to spend money on. So the tail end of COVID is very definitely the thing that is the biggest challenge, because it cuts across everything: health, education, and the economy.
Brilliant, thank you for that. I mean, yeah, it's a morbid thought. I think we're going to James Lowe next for a question. If you can unmute.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
My question is, if tuition fees was such a campaign-defining moment, why didn't you abolish them?
Well, I mean, that's the reality is that in a coalition government where there are 5 times as many Conservative ministers and MPs as there are Liberal Democrats, and when the Conservatives don't want to abolish tuition fees, it's very difficult to impose that on your much larger coalition partner. And they didn't want to abolish tuition fees. Now, maybe we could have, maybe we had more bargaining power than we thought we had. Maybe we could have stalled a discussion about tuition fees, and had we come to it 12 months later, perhaps our bargaining position would have been stronger. But the starting point was that they didn't want to abolish tuition fees than that we did, and we were outnumbered 5 to 1. So that's, I think the mistake. I think that's why I said earlier that, I don't want to go too hard on politicians who make pledges. I mean, we made a pledge of abolishing tuition fees, and had we been elected as a government, that I think I'm reasonably confident that is what we would have done. But we weren't elected as a Liberal Democrat government. We were elected in coalition, and so we weren't able to deliver that policy.
Yeah, I suppose that's the drive of pragmatic and prudent policy making, that you do have to sort of go with the times rather than have sort of, I suppose, dogma set in stone. I think we've got one final question, unless Varun comes back or Varun sends the question in the message. One from Scott, and he says, I think this is in relation to Keir Starmer's kind of leaked report about the whole sort of more flag waving and sort of more patriotism. What kind of role do you think patriotism would play in shaping a British constitution? Do you think it would be a positive or negative influence?
Well, I have no problem whatsoever with people who are patriotic. I'm patriotic. I'm proud to be British, but I'm also proud to be European. And I think that there's I don't have a problem with the Union Jack, and I don't think the Liberal Democrats have. I don't think the Labour Party has. I think that the difficulty is where patriotism sort of merges with nationalism, and I think then there is a problem. And I think you see that even in Scotland, for instance, with the SNP, where their nationalism is something that excludes, and identity politics excludes others. You're either with us or you're not. And if you're not with us, you're against us. And I think that is what nationalism sometimes becomes. But there's no reason for patriotism to do that. I'm proud to be British. And the reasons I'm proud to be British are to do with things like the fact that we are still a liberal democracy, and that we have values that say that we will respect people's rights. We will, if someone wants to pursue a particular lifestyle, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else, I don't give a monkeys. And that, I think, is the sorts of values that are why I am patriotic about being British.
Oh, well, I think that's our final question, as I think unfortunately Varun has dropped. So I think that, unless anyone else has any last minute things, I think that'll be about it. So all it leaves me and I suppose the rest of the committee to say.
Can I just say a quick word? So well, thank you very much for your time. I think that's been a really fantastic exchange. Lots of pertinent questions and probing questions. I hope that you will follow Unlock Democracy. I mean, you can join as supporters. So we got we're ramping up the number of campaigns we're running at the moment. We're running a campaign around devolution. So in other words, taking powers away from Westminster, giving it to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, regional authorities, local authorities, because we are very, very centralised as a nation compared to virtually any other European country. And so you can be a supporter simply by signing up to our campaigns. Membership, I think, is very decent at a couple of pounds a month. So there's no breaking the bank for if you want to join as a member. And we are a membership organisation. So the members of Unlock Democracy elects a council every 2 years, who are the people who set the strategy. So they define the strategy for the organisation. And then I and the members of staff working with me, we are responsible for delivering that strategy. So thank you very much. Very happy to come back and speak again.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you, Tom. It's very kind.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a lovely evening.
Have a lovely evening. Thank you for giving up your time.
No problem. Bye-bye. Cheers.
Bye.